Okay, so it turns out that there is in fact quite a lot of interstate variation in the extent of spread of private schooling, and states like Assam, Bihar have very low utilization of private schools. States like Telangana, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Kerala have very high levels of utilization of private schools. There is also a variation in terms of the age group. There's primary age group, there's the upper primary age group, there's the secondary age group and higher secondary. It turns out that what one would normally expect is that when children are sent to private school, that a greater proportion of children in the older age groups would be sent to private schools, and a progressively lower number would be in private schools at a younger age. In fact, you'd be surprised that in fact it is the opposite. At the primary school age group 6 to 10, if you take the India picture as a whole, in urban India, 49%, nearly 50% of children in the primary age group are attending private schools. In the upper primary age group, grades 6, 7 and 8, 41% of children are attending private schools, and in the secondary and higher secondary age group, 42% of children are attending private unaided schools. So in totality, 36% are attending in the secondary and upper secondary stage group, only 36%. So the situation is exactly perverse compared to what one would have imagined. 49% of primary school children primary school age children are attending private schools in the country. 41% of upper primary school age children are attending private schools in the country, and 36% of secondary and higher secondary age children are attending private unaided school. This is the picture in the urban areas. In the rural areas, it is roughly similar. There is a slight variation. In the primary age group, 21% are attending private unaided schools. In the upper primary age group, 17%, so again a reduced amount, 17% are attending private schools, 17.5%, and in the secondary and senior secondary age group, here it is higher in fact, here is 24.5% attending private unaided schools. So interstate variation and variation across the different age groups is there in the data. Now, if we were to look at the number of schools, so far we talked about the percentage of children who are going to different types of schools. Now let us look at how many schools there are in the different sectors. In India as a whole, if we were to take the major states of India, 21 major states which together constitute more than 97% of the total population of the country, because I have done the analysis for those major states which together constitute more than 97% of the population of the country. So 73% of the schools, elementary schools in the country are government schools, 19% are private schools. So I can tell you what the breakdown is of the different types of schools, and the answer is that I'm sorry that the statistics that I just read out was not quite right. So it's 73% of all the schools, elementary schools in the country are government schools, 4.6% of the schools are aided schools, and 19% of schools are recognized government schools, and 1.8% are recognized private schools, unaided schools, and 1.8% are unrecognized private unaided schools. Now, one thing you do need to understand is that the DICE data's coverage of private schools, private unaided schools, is patchy. Reason why it's patchy is because what I should have said to you earlier is that when we talk about the typology of different types of schools, there is not just government schools, aided schools, and private aided schools and private unaided schools. Within the private unaided schools segment, there is in fact the unrecognized private unaided schools and also the recognized private unaided schools. Question is, do we have data on both of them? The answer to that question is no, we do not have data on both unrecognized private unaided schools and the recognized private unaided schools. You might ask why? Why do we not have data on the unrecognized ones? And why is it that the DICE data is showing 1.8% of all the schools in the land, all the elementary schools in the country being unrecognized? Is it believable? Is it really the case? And if we added the DICE data's unrecognized and recognized schools as presented in the DICE data, the answer comes to that 21% of the schools in the country are private unaided schools. The reason why that statistic would be incorrect is because the private unaided non-recognized schools are more or less almost wholly absent from DICE data. And you can understand, you can sympathize with the government as to why it is that it hasn't got captured data on those schools. For one reason, the government doesn't recognize those schools. It may not even count them as quote unquote schools, for one reason. Secondly, these schools come up, there are in most states until the year 2009 when the Right to Education Act was passed, in many of the states there was no requirement on schools to even register with the government, let alone be compulsorily to have to get recognition, right. So, governments, many state governments do not even have a list of all the schools that exist which have not sought recognition from them. Now, since the coming of the Right to Education Act, of course, it is legally mandatory for schools to apply for recognition, and it's possible that many schools have, but we just do not know what number of schools exist which are not registered, which have not sought recognition, and which are therefore not included in the DICE data set. Having said that, there are studies that have looked at the totality of private unaided schooling, and therefore we have an estimate of what proportion of total private unrecognized schools, private unaided schools are recognized and non-recognized. There are 5 different studies from different parts of India that I collated, and in a paper called The Progress of School Education in India, I present this. This paper is published in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy in the year 2007. So it's a little old, this data, but at any rate, by the year 2007, there were at least 5 studies from different parts of India that presented evidence on that did a survey of all the private unaided schools in a locality, and that reported what percentage of them, what numbers were aided and what numbers were unaided, what numbers were unrecognized and what numbers were recognized private unaided schools. So when you total them up, what you realize, the summary of that research is that collating, including the probe report, for example, the public report on basic education, which studied private schooling phenomena and of course government schooling phenomenon as well, in 242 villages in 5 North Indian states. So when you looked at that, you found, according to the probe data, that about 62% of all the private unaided schools were unrecognized, right. So that means the majority of the private unaided schools were unrecognized. Now this was in 1996. The probe report data was collected in 1996. The probe report itself came out in 1999. But there was more recent data from 2005, 2004, 2006. There's a study by Professor Tilak. It was done in certain districts of Punjab and Haryana. There are some other studies from other parts. So these 5 studies, when you collate together, the conclusion that I came to by collating these findings from these 5 studies was that there are at least as many private unaided unrecognized schools as there are private unaided recognized schools. So if that is the case, then the number of unrecognized private schools in the country is grossly underestimated in the DICE data, and that is something that we should all be aware of, and it calls for government to really seek to extend the remit of its investigation and to try and collect the data on these schools. Now, we do know that governments are aware of a lot of these private unaided, unrecognized schools. How do we know that? We know that because in a lot of states, the governments are now giving notices to these unrecognized schools to close down. And so, for example, you can take almost any state, you'll find that there are big headlines in newspapers, 2,200 there are about 2,000 schools, unrecognized schools running in Lucknow district, for example. This is one of the headlines that has come out. There are about 2,000 unrecognized private unaided schools running in district of Lucknow. This has been one of the recent news headlines. So officials, education officials themselves are saying these things. It means that they are aware of the existence of the unrecognized private unaided schools. So I think that more of an effort can be made to enumerate their numbers accurately. Okay, so much for the numbers of private unaided schools and the distinction between unrecognized and recognized private unaided schools and how they are not really captured